Should gun owners be required to know small unit tactics? Should it be illegal to use judo outside of a classroom setting? Are our politicians failing simply because they aren't working hard enough? We tackle these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through our social media feeds, we find takes that are exceptional, either exceptionally good or exceptionally bad, and we like to riff on them and provide interesting perspective as to why they may be the way they are. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt. And before we get started, just a reminder to like and comment and share all that good stuff, and follow our socials at Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube, and Good Take Bad Take Pod on Instagram. Without further ado, we're going to get into our first take. This comes from David Hogg, prolific Twitter user, and he tweets, "I put an orange tile next to my name a few weeks ago to show my support for stronger gun laws. Since then, I've seen several hundred do the same. It would be awesome to see more join." And this is on Twitter, to be clear. And Jack Lloyd replies saying, "The orange square symbolizes gun control perfectly. A symbolic gesture that has nothing to do with the underlying issues and everything to do with getting other people to signal and conform." What do you think about that take, Britt?
Yeah. So we're critiquing Jack Lloyd's take. If any of you guys are fans of the show, you know that we obviously are not big fans of David Hogg, except for the rare instance where he was talking about deregulation of business. But
yes,
Jack Lloyd's tweet is a very, very good take, in my opinion. And I thought it was a particularly interesting insight into like, oh yeah, nothing actually gets done by putting an orange square. Like, you just do it to get some social clout. And maybe at best, it's just a marketing campaign, right, for David Hogg, that he can say, oh yeah, this whole movement of the orange square originated from me. And then when you play this out, obviously in the broader world with gun control arguments and things like that, it very much ties to it. That most people that are advocating for some sort of gun control, one, they don't even know what guns they are advocating to control. They don't know. They think that AR stands for assault rifle and AR-15. They don't realize that AR-15s are, like a fully automatic AR-15, or as they would call it, assault rifle. They've been illegal for a long time now, right? Or they're very hard to get legally. You'd have to have like $10,000 to do that if you wanted to. So it kind of puts it in the upper echelon for people to receive those. So those aren't like widely available and sold over the counter and things like that. And so all these people, when there's a lack of awareness and a lack of actual technical understanding of the issue, it means that their solutions are not good, and they're only based in emotion and only based on, I support the current thing. And so I think Jack's insight in that was interesting to me. And yeah, it's almost like stuff like this where these parallels occur make me want to believe we live in a simulation, because it's just too perfect, right? Yeah. And good on him for seeing it.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny because I've been thinking about more and more how the modern world is detached from real results in many ways. At least you can afford to be more than ever before, because you work many people can work in spheres that are, a level above the level where like actual things happen, if that makes sense, right? Like if you're working at a company that produces rubber bands, like if you're a white collar worker there, and your job isn't actually making sure that a rubber band comes out. Your job might be in marketing, like, to parallel this, where you're trying to get people aware about rubber bands and why they might need a rubber band. And that's an important task, and it matters and does create value in a sense. But it's not the exact same thing as actually, mending the rubber together and cutting it in such a way that it produces the thing and you physically have it in your hand. And so in that way, you hand off reports and you say, well, we've got X number of eyes on this and we've raised this much awareness, and that's all good and fine. But ultimately, you need some level of actual effect for that to matter and to mean anything. And that's exactly what Jack points out, that this orange tile is. It's all the first part of that, where you're, ideally for him, he's raising a bunch of awareness and getting people's eyes on it. But in reality, nothing actually happens. And that parallel is with gun laws in the same way, where it's like, oh, you can say you want all these great things to happen from we passed legislation. That's the accomplishment. But did you save any lives? Like
Yeah.
were there any actual real world implications, or was it just look something I can put as a checkbox next to my name? Oh, look, I have an orange tile next to my name, and so do they. That's the effect too. So many people are bragging about sort of the interim part of the equation, not the final output of the equation. And if you're sort of blue pilled, I don't mean this derogatorily necessarily, but you might think, well, even gun control advocates are, aiming in the same direction that we are, which is, a safer world. We would just argue that the output is completely different than what they think it is. And so if you're, sort of in the most generous interpretation, you can say that while their motives are good, the problem is they're celebrating at the halfway point of the equation, not at the final end result. Because the final end result doesn't, the orange tile for gun control, even if you pass the gun control laws, it doesn't actually make people safer or more well off. And that's what you
Yeah.
should be celebrating, not celebrating the, hey, look, we raised awareness for this. Cool that you raised awareness. If it doesn't actually do anything, doesn't keep people safer, it's not really much to brag about then.
And I think that the proponents of gun laws that are a little bit more informed, to counter your point, would say, well, the proof is in the implementation of these laws because places that have these laws have less gun deaths. Um, the problem with that, though, obviously, is that they don't have the goal should be reduction of absolute amount of death and suffering and violence and aggression and all those sorts of things. And regardless of what gun laws you have, when you compare apples to apples, we've talked about Hungary versus France versus other countries that have really strict gun laws. There is actually no reduction in overall violence. In some cases, there's actually an uptick in it because people that are not inherently violent but are purchasing a gun to defend themselves no longer are able to defend themselves. So that's how, when people counter with that argument and say, well, the US is uniquely violent with guns. It's like, well, yes, because we have more guns here and that's the tool of violence that occurs. But when you compare it, and it's actually not the top, I think it's like ninth in terms of gun violence in the world. So it's not number one, far and away. It's still up there, obviously. It is still, though, on par with other countries in terms of the absolute amount of violence per capita, as well as just overall violent crime, as well as I can't remember the study, and I'll have to find it and maybe mention on our next episode or something. But there was a study put out that guns also prevent, and it's hard to measure this properly, right? But they prevent and save almost the same amount of lives that they take in the United States, and that depends on how you quantify whether it saved a life. Was there an armory? Was there a robbery that was armed? And if that was armed, is there a chance that that person was going to be killed? Things like that. But regardless, guns. The calculus is much more much more complicated than the simple understanding of, well, less guns means good. That is not necessarily the case. The whole goal is to reduce overall violence and aggression and suffering. Yeah, you can reduce those things happening from guns, but they're going to happen from other things. And then the people that use guns as the great equalizer are no longer going to be able to do so.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. Um, I guess the last thing that I would add on this for me is the other thing you need to consider with people talking about we like here are the stats on guns, or here's the when we raise awareness we change the perception and we can end this. It's funny because a lot of what I would argue his strategy is with sort of the orange tile and that kind of thing is like change people's minds in order to pass legislation, right? Raise awareness, make people think about it, and then do. But really, the more powerful campaign of as far as like changing people's minds and awareness probably ought to do with the root of like what the majority of the gun violence that does happen in the US, like where that's coming from. And the
Mm.
problem is if you bring up any of that information, you get immediately canceled because it's not politically correct to say where the gun violence is coming from. And it's primarily coming from gang related activities. And, whether you want to blame, racial culture for that or not, to me, the racial aspect is a little bit less relevant than just the general culture point where like we need to address changing the hearts and the minds of gang culture first and foremost. And a lot of that has to do with fatherless homes and the idea of consequence free sex and that kind of that kind of root issue. So if we're talking about effective ways to actually stop gun violence, and we're talking about it in the context of changing people's minds and persuasion, then I think the more impactful thing to do is, rather than changing your name to have this tile icon to convince people who probably already agree with you that something should be done that's not actually going to do anything, it's probably doing the hard work of convincing people and changing hearts in the most difficult sectors,
Mm,
and causing the culture to recognize that there is value in the nuclear family, there's value in some of the historic traditions that has brought the West into a place of affluence and general peace. When we throw those out, then we're going to end up with more violent, you know, cultures and communities, regardless of what the tool of choice is, which happens to be guns at this point.
yeah.
Okay, we'll move on to the next take here. This one comes from Sterling Reese, who tweets: If you accept the proposition that your AR 15 is a tool for resisting tyranny, then you must accept the proposition that you should know small unit tactics. And you must further accept the proposition that you need to be in good physical shape. What do you think about this take here, Rich?
It's good and right. And I think it's logically consistent. I don't necessarily always like the bros that are like, oh, if you're not lifting and you're not able to run, a marathon, and you don't, go spend your weekends doing small unit tactics, in some quarry down in Olympia, that you shouldn't own an AR-15. I mean, that I think the qualifications for owning an AR-15 is: do you know how to operate it? Do you know how to take it apart and put it back together?
Yeah.
And do you know? And have you thought through the situations when you would pull it out? Right, that's the bare minimum. I do think these are all good things, though, right? Like, we should all know these things. I need a lot more drilling in small unit tactics. I feel like I've taken pretty good ownership of like the physical stuff. In the past 2 years, I've thought through that. Like, okay, like, and we're going to get to a take here in a minute, about someone using, their physical abilities to restrain someone. But like, in a lot of situations, like, I don't want to be forced to have to use my gun to stop, a situation if it can be prevented, right? If I can de-escalate in some non-violent or non-lethal manner, and I want that to be available to me. I want to be clear-headed enough to know and recognize what is a lethal encounter. And so all these things are like important, and I think I would append to his take. And that, to me, it's generally good. I don't like, the Chad elitist thing, that can sometimes happen with these sorts of deals. But I think that being a gun owner is a great responsibility, right? And it requires you to think through every single thing that you're going to do in the day to day. When I enter into a situation, and I'm carrying, I'm constantly thinking about, okay, like, if this or that happened, or if some assailant came in through this way, like, how would I deal with that? What is the things that are behind, potentially that assailant? And what are the potential casualties that could result, if I chose to use lethal force and deemed it necessary? Because in reality, you shouldn't use lethal force unless the only person that lethal force is going to be used on is the direct threat, right? But a lot of people don't think through that sort of stuff, and they just carry it.
Yeah, I would say the things that he recommends are good things that you should do. I don't like him phrasing it in such a way to say that if you accept that an AR-15 is a tool for resisting tyranny, then you also have to believe these other
Yeah,
things. It's kind of the same thing with, like, you're not pro-life unless you believe this litany of other things. Because I can think, no, actually, an AR-15 is a tool for resisting tyranny, and that's that. Like, that's the belief, period. The other things
yeah,
follow logically, and the other things follow if you're being consistent, but I don't think that it necessitates it, right? But I agree. I think it's one of those things where, on the one hand, we should highly recommend people own guns. We should highly recommend people be aware of self-defense, but then also highly stress that it is, like you said, a responsibility and something that you should rise to the challenge of. I think sometimes people think that if we believe that people should do something freely, and it should be a common thing or a popular thing, or there should be a low restriction to it, that also means that we think that you should go into it haphazardly, and that's not the case, right? I just think that the government is a particularly bad and the single worst actor for gatekeeping, who should or shouldn't have access to guns, because of the proposition that they're used for to defend tyranny. But that doesn't mean that I believe that people shouldn't go through the effort of, you know what people might want to regulate through the state. Things like taking a gun ownership class, taking a gun ownership, like shooting the safety class, those kinds of things, or practicing. I don't think it should be regulated by government, but I also think we need to encourage the culture to strongly do these types of things. And staying fit is also another one of those things where it's like that's that's generally a positive, good thing that you should do from all this. But again, I don't think you have to believe that
Yeah.
that in order to, think that your AR-15 is a tool for resisting tyranny, you have to do these other things. But I think he's right in that saying if you believe that, then it kind of logically follows in these other ways that in order to be consistent, you kind of want to do these things too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I like what you're saying in that you can accept the proposition that a hammer is supposed to hit a nail, um, without having the knowledge on how to frame the entire house together,
Yeah,
right? Like,
exactly.
it's like, well, I just want to have it in case I need to nail something.
Right.
And that's, yeah, again, like you're saying, it's really good to know whether how to frame everything. But the fact of the matter is that any sort of AR-15 or rifle that puts you on somewhat of an even footing ground with military ordnance is like a good thing to have, even if you're not trained in it,
Yeah.
right? Like you think about the
Yep.
Viet Cong in Vietnam, or you think about the goat herders in Afghanistan. Like a lot of them didn't have specialized small unit tactics. I mean, they kind of learned it along the way, and a lot of them died and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that a gun, a 5.56 bullet, uh, is just as deadly and lethal, regardless of whether you know small unit tactics or not. And if you have enough people with them, it's enough of a deterrent, right? So even if I would rather have, and I guess like maybe I'm flipping a little bit on whether it's a good or bad take, but mainly just taking issue with the beginning of it. But I would rather have every single American like own an AR-15 and like less than 1% know any sort of small unit tactics and be in like what this guy would probably consider good physical shape than the inverse, right? Because
Right.
just the mere existence of those means that the government stays in check and knows that it can't do certain things.
Yeah, yeah. So I think maybe, I think that it depends on how strict you're going on his interpretation, and that's kind of hard to interpret in the single
Sure.
tweet. So maybe this is a good take with just kind of a little bit of a disagreement in some of the semantics, or maybe it's a bad take because he's really stressing like you have to hold these things. I'm not sure. But yeah, I agree. I think that's right because I mean, you even think about how much people could get away with uh, in the US during the COVID lockdowns, which was not a lot, but it was way
Yeah.
more than places like Australia or
China.
China, obviously, is a
Yeah.
very extreme example. So,
Yeah. You want in America, in a place that had a lot of folks owning AR-15s, you would not have people being welded into their house or apartment.
yeah, yeah,
They'd just be too
exactly.
scared. They couldn't do it.
Yep. All right. And to our next take here, we got a tweet and a follow up tweet, I believe, from the same individual. Other Marines are questioning Penny's actions, and one has started a petition calling for his prosecution, arguing Penny did not act in accordance with the training Marines receive. This is a quote, and then they're commenting on that, saying it should be illegal to use military force training in a civilian setting. My husband was a judo master. He said it was illegal for him to use his knowledge outside of the classroom setting. Okay, do you want to give us a little bit of context here, and then
Yeah. Have you seen the stuff with Daniel Penny?
I'm very vaguely familiar with it, but I was
Oh
traveling
man.
when it was been going on. So
Okay, so in the past year, there's been about 25 people killed in New York City subways, whether they've been
yeah.
pushed in front of a train or assaulted or anything like that. Probably a lot more assaults that we don't know about. I don't know the numbers on them. Um, anyways, a guy named something Neely, I can't remember his first name, is Jared or Jacob or
Oh,
something like
Jordan,
that.
I think.
Jordan Neely, was on a train, was saying things like, "Oh yeah, I want to kill all of you, and I'm willing to die to do it." Was becoming very, very violent. According to some people, he actually, I think, struck someone. And that's when Daniel Penny and two other men on the subway decided they were going to restrain him. Part of the restraint was Daniel put him in a rear naked chokehold, and then he passed out. And then, within a few minutes of him passing out, I mean, it might have even been seconds, honestly. They put him in a recovery position, and then a couple hours later, Jordan Neely died at a hospital. Everyone, including the police, the people on the subway, all the passengers, and everyone said, "Oh yeah, that was like clearly self defense. This guy was assaulting people on this subway train." And then, they declined to prosecute him. And then there was a big old outrage from AOC and other politicians saying, "Oh yeah, like this is the reality of being a black man in America. A white man can choke you out on a train." And so now with that, Alvin Bragg, who's also prosecuting Trump, decided that he was going to also prosecute Daniel Penny. And so one of the big backdrops, obviously, is that Daniel Penny is a Marine. So, but anyways, this lady's and I guess I'm assuming she's a lady because she said my husband, but maybe people have different views of things nowadays. But I'm assuming this lady, her husband was a judo master and things like that. She just doesn't know anything about what she's talking about. The rear naked choke is not a strictly military force training, maneuver or tactic or submission. I mean, it's something that is used everywhere. You could watch UFC cards on the weekend, and you would see a rear naked choke in almost every single one of them that occurs. It's taught in every single jujitsu class. It's taught in every single type sort of grappling class out there, and it's not illegal to use it, especially in the event of self-defense. Right? I don't know what she's talking about with her husband being a judo master. Yeah, it's illegal to go around judo flipping people if they haven't done anything to you, for sure. Like, of course, that's just assault. You don't need to even be a judo master to have that be illegal. But it is perfectly legal to use judo. At least it should be, and it is in most states to defend yourself. Apparently, not in New York though anymore.
Yeah, this is a bizarre take. I love the idea that you're in public and someone rushes you with a knife, and your instinctive training as a judo master is to like deflect the blow and like redirect him and knock him to his feet, and then the police come swarming and arrest you, for
Dude,
deflecting the attack.
yeah.
I don't I don't think it's like the uh, uh, I'm not there. I don't know specifically, but I have to assume that the husband saying it was illegal probably means like he has a self, like his classes or his training says that he shouldn't use these techniques in civilian life, because there's a lot of
Yeah.
discipline codes on those kinds of, in martial arts and stuff to say like you should never use this in an outside setting unless your life's in danger kind
Yeah.
of instruction. But that's also always part of it, right? Is unless your life's in danger. And so the idea that there's this carte blanche, no, you can never use it. I mean, this is the similar kind of take to the idea of gun control, which is people freaking out that there are dangerous tools, and they're ignorant of the fact that people are going to be violent and use whatever they can. And so it is good for people who are balanced, normal, and responsible to use those kinds of tools to defend themselves and others. That is a good thing. You should use every tool available that you have to diffuse violence in public, whether that's your judo moves or military training or whatever a gun even in that case.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of people saying things like, "Well, he was just on the train, being really, aggressive, and yeah, he hit someone, but does that really deserve the death penalty, right?" And like to a normal person, that sounds like fairly reasonable, but if you've ever experienced any sort of violence in your life, whether in a controlled or an uncontrolled setting, you realize that the line between it being like more or less harmless or at least like traumatizing to it actually being life threatening is really really thin, right? Like you can look up videos online about, and to bring it back to the gun stuff, like after, if you defend yourself, let's say that you're in a mall and someone brings out an AR-15 and you shoot that person in self-defense of you and others, after they fired on people and stuff like that, like the thing you should do right away, the first thing is you need to holster your gun, because
Yeah.
there could be a police officer on the site or anything like that, and if they mistake you for a potential threat, like they're going to shoot you. And the reason why is because if you have a gun out and you're maybe it's not even pointed at the officer, all it takes is for them to point it at you really quickly and shoot, right? Like that's how quick it is. That's why people in those situations have to make split second decisions. With violence like this, it goes from 0 to 100 really fast. And if if you're someone that is being aggressive against innocent people, it's not a matter of fact that you deserve to die or anything like that, but that's part of the risk of being
Right.
unjustly aggressive on a train in a closed setting against people who don't want to be aggressed upon. It's the same thing of like, hey, look, like you don't deserve, if you go drive, walk across that rickety rope bridge over the jungle ravine. It's like, yeah, you don't deserve to die, but that's a part of the risk that you assume in doing that. And so, this Jordan Neely guy, had a lot of issues. Obviously, it's very sad, and I'm sad that he had to die. But it was part of the risk, and it was part of the responsibility of good people on that train to restrain him. And it's a tragedy that he's being prosecuted. Daniel Penny is
Yeah,
being
I was gonna say he
prosecuted.
was charged for manslaughter.
Yeah,
If I remember, which
the
is
family
ridiculous.
wants to get him on murder.
Yeah, which is insane. I it's one of those things where I've always tried to advocate for this idea that your response to a situation needs to roughly be equal to the initial situation itself, like the threat of it, right? And that's part of, one of the advantages of the idea of a jury is that those kinds of things can be evaluated. And unfortunately, I think the culture is going in such a way that the average perception of someone may or may not be accurately judging this kind of thing. But t- people who haven't encountered that kind of violence face to face, it's really easy to sort of, you know, coach from the benches and call shots from the benches and say, oh, well, that was obviously an over aggressive exertion of force. And that's like, for one thing, when you're in that situation, you do have like fight or flight, like your adrenaline is going. And so that is one of those things where it's like you can try to measure yourself and you can still go even a little overboard. But the other thing is that there's so many factors that go into how someone is going to react from that, where like, let's say that this, this guy, this kind of wacko guy had been, eating super unhealthy his whole life, and he gets put into um
Yeah.
that hold position, has a heart attack. Is that the fault of the Marine who put him, tried to restrain him from attacking because, oh, he excited him in such a way that he gave him a heart attack? It's like, well, no, that you have to admit that at least a lot of the responsibility is on the individual for not eating healthy and not being a in good physical shape. That's going to be part of the reason why he has a heart attack. And then when you put yourself specifically in a situation where you are causing justification to be stopped, then you can't blame the person who does the stopping. So there's so many different, factors and depths of angles that need to be analyzed for this, that I just feel like people just, they don't want to think about, and instead they just want to slap a label like it should be illegal to use, X category of moves. That'll fix it. It's like that doesn't fix anything. Like this, the Marine literally could have just like pushed him against the wall, in a single move, and you potentially had the same effect. You never
Yeah.
know, right?
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. And the thing about the second you decide it's time to restrain someone, and three of the passengers on that train thought it was time to restrain Jordan Neely. The second it's time to restrain them, it's like there is no half measure of
Yeah,
pushing it. It's like they're either restrained or they're not, and so you got to get to that. And that's what, like I was talking about. That's part of the risk if you are aggressive in public against innocents. Whether you hit someone or you're threatening someone, realize that someone at some point is going to think, and rightfully so, believe that you've crossed a line, and they're going to deem it necessary to restrain you. And part of that risk that comes with being restrained is that you could die, right? And I've seen a lot of leftists and people that know nothing about any of this stuff being like, oh, a rear naked choke, this deadly thing that's taught in the Marines. It's like, man, I got rear naked choked like just 2 days ago and almost
yeah,
passed out in a jujitsu class. So it literally happens tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times, probably every single day, by trained people. It's not a uniquely sadistic move. It's purely a submission, right? It's a way to restrain someone, to stop them from trying to hurt someone or doing aggressive actions. And yes, it does carry the risk of death. And maybe Daniel Penny performed it slightly wrong or held on a little bit too long in order to preserve the guy's life. But that is not on Daniel Penny's. It's not. The impetus is not on him to ensure that. The impetus on him was to defend other people in that, and he did a good job.
yeah,
So it's a travesty. He's being prosecuted.
yeah. The context is everything, and I think the context, even the context around not even that particular situation, just the amount of violence that's happened on New York subways alone
Yeah.
is like enough to give you at least a second thought on this, right?
Yep.
All right, we'll move on to our next take, and this one comes from the take will critique comes from Lauren Southern, but she quote retweets another person who has attached I believe it's Coors Light commercial That's going, another way of the woke commercial, kind of like the whole Dylan Mulvaney controversy earlier. And attached to this video, this first tweet says, "Modern corporations hate making money. That's the only explanation." And Lauren Southern quote retweets this, saying, "Another theory. Most large corporations have access to all our online data. Next gen of consumers are just genuinely more progressive. The companies know it will have a negative impact in the short term, but will be worse in years to come if they don't adjust branding now." What do you think about Lauren's take here?
I don't know. I think my initial impression is I don't think it's a good one. I really like Lauren Southern in general, but when I say I don't think it's a good one, I don't know if it's right
Mm,
necessarily. I mean, there's been a lot of hypothesizing around the Bud Light stuff that occurred. I mean, we saw the VP of marketing giving her spiel of why she chose to do the Dylan Mulvaney commercial. And then obviously the CEO and other folks at the company were saying things like, "Oh, we didn't know this was going to happen, or we didn't know she was doing this," and then they fired her and things like that. And so, part of me, and I guess my theory is that it's like, no, we are just now starting to see people that have very low morals, really relative values, now starting to come into positions of VP level and director level power. And because those people are coming into power, they're doing this because they think it's right. Like they truly believe it's right. I had a startup. One of my co-founders truly believed some of this stuff was right. I challenged him on it and changed his mind on most of it, which was great. But he truly believed it, right? That this was the right thing to be doing, even if we lost money on it. And that's why I think you see some of these things happening. I think why you see some of the older people that Gen X folks that are actual in the C-suite saying, "Oh crap, we need to stop doing this." You would think that every single beer company, though, would, to Lauren's point, would institute some controls, into their advertising for stuff like this. I also think that and this is a little bit further out there, but I think that the algorithm of social media, I don't think it's tied to value, if that makes sense. In that, like, what gets people to the algorithm rewards things that hold attention, that get clicks, and kind of if you kind of go along that line, also generate outrage and generate certain types of feelings. And so, the more outrageous things you have, I mean, it's like the Elsa Gate stuff, right? Where programmers were making auto-generated YouTube videos, and they were feeding it with data of saying what gets the most amount of playtime and most amount of like clicks, and it was stuff that was absurd.
yep.
These cartoon characters doing crazy bad things, and then it was getting into children YouTube videos and stuff like that.
Yep.
So the algorithm feeds that. It's not necessarily tied to like because the point of advertising is to generate customers buying your product, but the only metric that advertisers have is a lagging indicator, which is, well, we want to get views on this. And so therefore they like the algorithm kind of incentivizes this type of content, even though this content doesn't actually generate the end result that they want, which is to make more money. So that for those reasons, I think Lauren is wrong. Like, yeah, that other theory is a little bit more out there, I'd say.
Yeah, I struggle with this because I could see it going both ways, right? I think she's wrong in that I don't think that the large corporations' data tells them this
Yeah.
can like in a way that is like so concrete that it's just the natural progression of movement. I just don't think that that is true. But what I do think is that companies have been trying to shift into this branding slowly and bit by bit because they do know that this is true. So I
Mhm.
think I think like the beer commercials are examples, not to Lauren's point,
More
but I think
defensive. Is it?
yeah, I think the general branding shifts where you have, you know, M&M's celebrating Pride Day or like things that weren't actually news before, like Oreos like doing a rainbow cookie, things that weren't they just kind of slowly bit by bit. That incrementalism I think is much more aligned with Lauren's theory, which is this is the way that the younger generation is going. This is the culture. We're going to start integrating this now. I think that these two beer examples though, I think it's I'm much more on your side, which is that I think it's like true believers who want to instigate this in a move that they feel like they're doing like a social justice service. the term social justice warrior is somewhat maligned online now as sort of this cringe term from like the 2010s of the anti-social justice warrior movement. But the social justice warrior term is very accurate, and it was used for a reason, because people who believe in a lot of the progressive left woke ideology really do view themselves as the modern civil rights movement and the modern moral cause for things like, whether it's black equality through Black Lives Matter, or whether that's trans representation through advertising campaigns like that. But the point is that they view themselves as militant soldiers in so many ways, and I think that that is these kinds of bold commercials in your face, not particularly in a specific industry that it is very counterculture to do that. I think that is much more of a, we're going to go out on a moral crusade here, acting more as a martyr than as a, we're trying to adjust our brand for the future. To me, it's the small incrementalist changes that indicate that, not these kind of broader, bolder commercials.
Yeah, I was remembering. Can't remember the razor company specifically,
Oh,
but
Gillette.
Gillette. You saw that commercial? Like,
It was a while ago, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, it was like from the '70s or something. Just
Maybe
complete.
maybe not.
Oh well. So sorry. Gillette did have a commercial from the '70s, totally affirming of masculinity. Like it was just a commercial of showing men working with wood and going home and loving their wife and like playing with their kids and things like that. It's like for all of life's things, like be smooth with Gillette, and it was just so traditional,
Right.
but probably considered somewhat like it had all the like hallmarks of the 1970s and 80s, like film in it and things like that. And so like those people believe that, right? And they also believe that it would resonate with their audience. And so I guess maybe to Lauren's point, maybe the VPs of these places believe that everyone believes like they do, right?
Yeah.
So maybe it is both, right? It's both only done by true believers, and it's done because they also think that like people are going to buy into it. I mean to Lauren's point again, the VP of marketing at Bud Light said like, "Oh, we want to transform this from a frat boy beer into whatever she was going to try to
Yeah.
transform it into." But it turns out the only people buying it are frat boys. So, yeah, if no one wants to buy, no frat boy, no man that has any ounce of desire to, portray masculinity into the world wants to buy Bud Light anymore, because it's been associated with a man who is cosplaying as a woman, aka Dylan Mulvaney. So yeah, I don't know. I still think that it's like it is driven by true believers. I don't think there's like some grand like corporate strategy of thinking like the Japanese do 50 years down the line. Like, what are the incremental things we need to do right now so that our marketing and branding is on par 50 years later? I really do think it's just reactive and driven by these true believers, as you said.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. It's either way. It's not a good direction. But
No.
I think I don't know. I have a hard time believing that these corporations have this massive amount of data, and it's so algorithmically smart that it's going to detect that we're going to tank now, but in 30 years your kids are going to love us.
Yeah.
I
No
don't,
way. They care so much about the quarters. There's no way that they would
yeah,
do that.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, and for our last take here, this one this one comes on some new song that Dolly Parton has written, and she was interviewed about it and asked. So Dolly Parton voiced her frustrations with modern politics in her new song "World on Fire." When asked what politicians she was referencing, this is in the middle of an article, but it'll be clear. But when asked what politicians she was referencing, Parton flatly stated, "All of them, any of them. I don't think any of them are trying hard enough. I'm sure we're all trying, but I just really I think often that they worry more about their party than they do about the people," she elaborated in an interview on Today. Parton expanded on her frustration, noting she wished politicians would focus more on issues rather than optics. "If we would just do what we felt was the right thing, rather than who's going to lose or who's going to win this or who's going to look better if they do this. None of them are working from the heart." This has got a lot of things to tackle. What's your
Yeah.
initial take here?
My initial take is they're Dolly. They we what we really want if we want this to all get better is not for them to try harder. Like that's the last thing we want. The last thing we want is for any of these politicians to get smarter and work harder. Uh, and I think I like her sentiment, I guess, and I don't really know much about Dolly Parton, to be honest with you. I know that puts me as kind of I was homeschooled, so I guess you have to grant me that. Um, but she just gets the entire issue wrong, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not it's a feature, it's not a bug. The feature of them not trying hard enough, and I'm saying that in her words of like trying to actually solve issues or make life better for the American people. They are incentivized to not do that because the second they solved everything, they would no longer have any more jobs, right? They would know they are incentivized to create controversy. They're incentivized to continuously need to ask for more money because they come up with problems, and they are not incentivized to ever solve them because, like I was saying, if they ever did that, then the gravy train stops. Or they're at least incentivized to keep the problems bad enough and funding people outside of the government long enough that they have some, build some sort of nice golden parachute at Lockheed Martin for all the wars that they, continue to prop up. So that's why I don't like this take. It's that it's like it makes someone think that, oh yeah, if we just voted for the right person, they would, everything would be fixed. It's like no, it's more of a fact that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and in fact, only people that were absolutely corrupt ever seek absolute power in the first place.
Yeah, to me, this strikes me as like the best blue pilled outlook, which I think is
Mm,
still a bad take,
yeah.
but I think it's wrong, and I think it's wrong for the reasons you said. But like, if you believe that the system worked, if you believe that there was ever a point at which it did or could work, this would be sort of your perspective here
Yes.
in maybe a best case scenario. But I also, even in that, I do think I have a few problems with it. Like the last line, let's see, none of them are working from the heart. And if we just do what we felt was the right thing, both
Mm,
of those are very, very postmodern sentiments that I have a
yes.
huge issue with. Um, on Sunday, our pastor was talking about um, a particular passage from Mark, one of the stories, and one of the points he was making is how faith in and of itself is not a virtue. Faith is not
Mm,
a good thing to have if the object of your faith is not worth it, right? Just having faith doesn't matter. And it's funny because one of the things he cited, he didn't bring it up in the sermon, but it was in the sermon notes, was an article from the Tampa Bay Times from 2007. And I went and looked, and it was an article about Mitt Romney speaking before he'd announced his candidacy for president, but it was very, speculated. And he was at this Florida retirement center, and it was like 1,000 people, and most of them welcomed him. But one person shouted him down, saying, like, you're a Mormon, you don't believe in the true God. Get out of here. We don't want you. And that guy was booed. But Romney had a very winsome response that everyone cheered and applauded, and he said something along the lines of, you know, well, we may not agree, but it's important that we have people of faith in this country because we need, these kinds, it's important that people have
wow.
that faith, even if we don't agree exactly. And it's such a vapid and empty sentiment. And unfortunately, it's what Dolly Parton echoes here. And it's because if you don't have a moral foundation of what truth is and what goodness is, then you actually have nothing further to stand on. That's all you can
Great
believe in.
point.
That the idea of faith or the idea of working from your heart, what you feel is right, is good and matters. But think about how ridiculous this is, because let's assume, for the sake of argument, that these politicians all of a sudden you snapped your fingers and they were working really hard and they weren't worrying about optics. Okay, then if we just do what we felt was the right thing, great. Well, now you still have deadlock because you have half of the people who are trying to say that like gun control is good and half of them saying gun control is bad. Again, if you take them at your word, I'm not that naive, but hypothetically speaking. And then, okay, so who's right? Because they both feel they're doing the right thing and they're both working from the heart. I mean, again, that's it's a futile sentiment, and it's not based on anything eternal, permanent, true, and good. It's based on the vapid, postmodern, what you feel is right, and that ultimately leaves you in a spiral of the kinds of politicians that we deserve if we believe in this postmodern gibberish, which is ultimately a will to power. The Nietzschean sort of all that matters is the aggregation of power. And that's what we have because we're in this postmodern world. I think people would argue in the past, politicians had more noble causes. And I might grant you that you were more likely to have politicians who went in with noble, virtuous ideals and intents, but I would also argue that the system itself corrupts people there and brings out the worst in people and brings out the worst people as well. So that the system has been designed to fail from the start, even if you grant that, these virtuous people early on, when America had a more moral or singular foundation of core of ideals, uh, when those people were getting in office, I still think that the system fails and reeks and wrecks them. But now even more so when you have people saying things like, none of this would work, or this would all work if we just worked from the heart, and if people just did what they felt was right. I mean, that's what we're doing. That's what we have now. We have politicians doing
Yes.
what they feel is right. What feels right is happens to feel really good to them, and like a lot of money and a cushy lifestyle.
Yeah, we've gone through these types of takes before, but the whole COVID policy, now that the COVID vaccine policy more specifically, now that it's all been debunked to saying, oh yeah, it doesn't work. I even saw an article by the New York Times that said, oh yeah, the COVID timing is important to the COVID vaccine. Those who get it in the afternoon have slightly higher efficacy. It's like, okay, so now it works good as long as you take it every 6 months and you take it at lunchtime. Essentially. But I've seen people justify. We've gone through these takes. I was talking with someone close to me about it the other day as well, saying, "Well, yeah, you're right. Like you got everything right, Britt. Like the vaccines mandate shouldn't have been put in place. They didn't work. All these different things. But unlike you, who this person knows, I care about people. Most of the people, their main reason for not getting the vaccine was because they just didn't care about anyone, and at least the rest of us cared about people. It's like, yeah, man, like you did what you felt was the right thing and it resulted in a lot of evil, right? So maybe your methodology for how this all works is not the best way to go about living your life, not the best way to evaluate truth statements, not the best way to actually design how you affect millions of people in the country, just on what we're feeling. And the fact of the matter is Dolly Parton should ask herself, how do these politicians keep getting elected if they do such a bad job? It's like, oh well, they are doing things to, and she talks about it. They do things with optics in mind. Why do they do things with optics in mind? It's because people vote with what they feel is the right thing, not with what they actually know. And so it's really funny that she contains both the poison and the cure, she contains the poison to her hypothesized cure in her same post
yeah, that's
or interview.
that's a very astute observation. I don't think I have any more unless you want
All
to
right,
any
I'm
last
good.
comments. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate you listening, and make sure to like and share if you enjoyed this, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.